as we come into this now, which is about the priorities, opportunities and risks, and setting those objectives. So being really clear about what your priority and objective is for the procurement can help that. So yeah, there's definitely a challenge of when we're comparing apples and oranges, but if we're able to figure out what the priority is, so if it is reduction in carbon, that will hopefully help assess the outcomes that the different suppliers or contractors are offering.
So we mentioned earlier, we talked about strategic levers and knowing which ones to pull. If you have a whole field of vision filled with levers and lots of different issues from carbon and circular economy and human rights and modern slavery, which ones do you prioritize? A couple of points. Firstly, not all sustainability topics will apply to every category of spend or every procurement activity. So if you're procuring laptops, you probably can't encourage local employment. If you're going to look at a catering contract, you might not be able to involve carbon. So not every sustainability topic will apply to every category. And it's important, especially with so much on our plates at the moment, multiple projects, deadlines, priorities, you need to understand where to focus time and effort. So this is what we're going to just unpick during this section. It's important to identify priorities at a spend category level. Now, spend category refers to the type of product or services being purchased. That might be in construction or facilities and facilities management, and might be under waste or IT, but it relates to, the priorities will relate to different spend categories.
And so why this is important and why we want to think about what we're spending and what the priority might be is because it helps us set those sustainability objectives. So by identifying what the priorities are up front, that flows into setting the objective, it tells us what risk needs to be managed, and that then will help determine all of the things throughout procurement. So what's that level of engagement that we need with suppliers? What are the clauses or criteria that we need to include? How are we going to evaluate? And what are those contract or performance obligations? So this is why we've got a whole section on prioritizing, because once you get it right up front, and again, coming back to Sam's example of specifying it in design up front, being super clear about what we want to achieve should then flow on throughout the rest of the procurement. So thinking about where to start, I'm going to go through this next section briefly, but there's a lot of info on the slides and we will be sharing it through at the end. I'm going through it briefly just so we can catch up on time. But basically, in terms of where to start, where to prioritize, we just think about where we've got that high influence or where there's high impact or high spend. So we know we've got kind of lower spend, maybe lower impact, which would be nice to address if we had all the time in the world. But we want to focus on where's that big spend. And so if we look at the guide, that's where we're focused on construction, facilities and waste.
So what I'd love you to do now is come off mute. We're going to have some ideas, just a call out session. Nicole had that sort of high spend, high impact, high influence up at the top here, and you can see down at the bottom low spend, low impact and low influence. We're just going to do this really quickly, don't overthink it. I'm not going to call out people's names, but I'm going to trust you to come off mute and give us some ideas. Where would water bubblers sit? Are those high or low?
They're low in terms of volume.
Yep, probably low in terms of influence and impact. How about a fleet contract?
High.
Yep, that's a high one,
Yeah,
as far
high.
as I can see. Yep. Waste collection. Justin, don't put your hand up. High?
High.
High.
Super high.
Playground equipment. Where's that?
Probably high because it stays for a time. And
It's there for a long time. Yep. Council catering contract. How high or low is that?
Low.
Low.
Probably low to medium, yes, depending on obviously the length of the contract. The electricity contract.
Very
How
high.
High.
Okay.
Very high.
Right up there. Okay. Changing light bulbs from fluoro to LED. How low or high?
Medium.
High.
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 Medium to
High.
high. Yeah. Good.
High.
Well, how
Street
long are they
lighting?
going to be in there? And
Street lighting.
lastly, concrete footpaths.
Delivery. Yeah, that's
High.
pretty high.
High.
high. There's lots of them.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of them, so let's put them right up there.
That's high.
Good. There. Thank you. So I think these are some of the, I know that was a really quick exercise, but to looking at how relevant is it, how critical, how much influence do you have, but also what kind of effort is needed to make those changes are really important when you're looking at prioritizing.
I'm going to step through four things that you can do to help prioritize. So there's a bit of a process, and as I said, come back to this at the end of the training to think through. And even from that quick discussion there, we could see, yes, there were some differing opinions, and this is why it's useful to prioritize upfront and just do it once for your different categories year upon year. That way it's done. And at the beginning of each procurement, you don't need to come back and do this. So once you've got your priorities for specific spend categories, it then makes it simpler. You've got those objectives set up front year upon year. So first, what we just did then is mapping. So looking at what are those different spend categories and what are they made up of. So if we take a high spend category, for example, construction or parks and gardens, let's think through what is within that category. And that's everything from the raw materials to the different services to where things might be coming from, the different types of suppliers, small or large. Once you've understood what's within the category, then just go through that process of identifying those opportunities and risks. So understanding what the impact is, and that might be environmental or social. And this is something you can do internally. So just do research on what's publicly available. You can get people with expertise within that category to support. Look at different resources that's out there. There are, this isn't the first time that people have tried to identify risk within spend categories. There is information out there. And I specifically want to mention Waverley Council's Sustainable Procurement Heat Map tool, which is an excellent resource. And I really encourage everybody to have a look within council. Waverley has said that they're willing to share that, which is fantastic. It's basically hot-spotted the issues for all the different procurement categories, and this is the prioritisation step. That is, I think, missing from a lot of councils in understanding what those impacts are for the different spend categories, and that will then understand those opportunities. Pop you on mute, David.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So the next step then, once we understand what those opportunities and issues are, we know that everybody's feeling overwhelmed right now because we know that there's so many of them out there. So that's why the prioritisation process is so important. And as we've already seen, all the councils, you've already got sustainability goals and targets or commitments. So lean on those. That's your council, your organisational objectives, and that should go down into procurement. So that's one step for prioritising. The other step is just going through that high likelihood and impact. So, if we go down this opportunity, what's the level of impact? What's the likelihood that we can have a change? And so coming back to the strategic levers, we've got those risk management frameworks in place, and you can use that as a tool to do this. So go through that. What's the likelihood of this happening? What's the consequence? And then what's our mitigation actions as well? Ability to influence suppliers is also a really important one. So if you're dealing with a supplier, you're spending a small amount of money, maybe they're not really going to be bothered to meet your sustainability objectives. Perhaps that goes down the priority list. Whereas an energy contract, perfect example of where councils have such a big spend. And so people want to win this work. And so you're able to set some benchmarks and they will come to the party for you. So that's where councils do have leverage and influence. And of course, the cost and benefits of addressing those opportunities or risks as well. And you might have noticed I'm talking about opportunities rather than risk here. So trying to frame this positively, it's about looking at where can we have a positive impact. So lastly is assess and address. So you've understood what the issues are, you've prioritised them down into just 2 or 3 key sustainability objectives for that type of procurement. And again, hopefully once you've done this once, you only need to come back to it every now and then to refresh it if things change. So you've got your priorities, and now we want to think about, okay, how are we going to use procurement to address these risks or opportunities? And we've touched on a lot of this throughout already. So involving suppliers early in the procurement process, let them know in advance what your sustainability priorities are, and consider using those mandatory sustainability criteria to get those outcomes that you want. So if we have a look at, say, concrete as an example, we've looked at construction, we've identified that carbon is the biggest impact within the materials that we're using in construction. We've so prioritised carbon as the sustainability objective for that procurement, and we're assessing, okay, how are we going to achieve our objective using procurement, which is through supplier engagement and that setting of clauses and criteria, including it in evaluation, and then measuring and performing it. So this is all coming back to having those clear sustainability objectives for procurement.
And so we also need to be aware that we need to review and update this prioritization as we go. A lot of things have happened over the last 18 months, over the last 2 years, that have caused massive disruptions to supply chains, to our existing business models. The report released recently from the Institute of Supply Chain Management showed that 75% of companies are reporting supply chain disruptions due to COVID-19. Of course, we saw the bushfires, which have led to really enormous supply chain disruptions, and there will probably be future ones. So this is not a set and forget type of list. Even for concrete, we need to look at our procurement processes and be prepared to reprioritize and update around COVID and cleaning practices, around all sorts of things as we go. We are going to hop into breakout rooms as the last thing we do before we go to our break. What we'd like you to do is you'll nominate a speaker in your breakout group. What we'd like you to do is go through this spend category for parks and gardens and zero in on landscaping, and go through those 4 steps: the map, identify, prioritize. Now, probably decide on one priority out of all of them, and assess. How can you use the procurement process? We will be sending these instructions through into your breakout group, so you will see it pop up in your breakout group as well. You're not expected to remember all of this. You will get an invitation to join the group. Please click to join that group. This will be timed very carefully, just on 10 minutes, and we'd like, as I said, you to map, identify, prioritize, and decide on one priority, and assess.
And just think about keeping it simple. So you've only got 10 minutes, so just try and spend a minute on each of these and come up with a couple of examples. And if you look in the chat, these instructions are within there. So we'll go into breakout rooms now.
Okay, we'll wait for everybody to come back in the room. We won't get everybody to share back, but I may just pick on Sam, who I got to nominate in our room to be a speaker, and maybe share the process that we went through in the room of that map, identify, prioritize, assess. Sam, do you want to give us a quick example of some of the risks and opportunities that came up and how we're going to address them?
I think we just looked at key risks and opportunities, pollution through site management. The use of chemicals is one of Waverley Council's sustainable procurement questions, and how for landscaping, how they reduce chemical use. And biodiversity loss is another risk. The opportunities are biodiversity creation. And I think the key one, which we'd probably prioritise, is the reuse of mulch, soil, timber or stone. And the other question that Waverley has in this area is a specific question that we ask for these tenders is the reduction of water use. But we often have issues with this that contractors, because that's not a cost to them, it comes on our water bill, they use excessive amounts of water. How would you assess that? You'd ask questions both in the evaluation of the methodology. So how is the contractor going to do that? So that's not necessarily in the sustainability criteria. But in terms of sustainability criteria, a specific question on how you would reuse materials on site or nearby to reduce overall material use. I think that covers it.
Well done. That was excellent. Better than I would have. Absolutely. We talked a lot about evaluation and how to use that. And just mentioning there as well, in order to evaluate, we needed to communicate upfront to those suppliers as well. So being really clear about what those priorities were so that the suppliers have a chance to be evaluated. Great. So I'm not going to go around the room with all the groups, but we've got a couple other breakout rooms. So hopefully all the groups do get a chance to share back. All right. So just a quick recap. And if anybody has any questions on this, feel free to call out or pop it into the chat as well. I think the main thing to remember is that, you know, you're not going to get a perfect outcome the first time. This is something that can be finessed over time, but once you do get it, it just makes procurement so much easier once we understand what the key objectives are for each type of spend category. So yeah, it really is setting up that foundation for embedding sustainability into the procurement process, being clear about those objectives up front and making sure that everybody is clear on them, so that suppliers and anyone doing procurement within council. Definitely review as priorities and risks arise or change, and as always, start small. You're not going to achieve all of these at once, as you probably saw in the breakout rooms. There's so many risks and opportunities to address. So start small and then we'll get there over time. So there's a big list of resources as well, including within the recommendations report. Have a look at ISO 2400 as well, because there's a big list of sustainability issues within there that you can consider. Definitely suggest reaching out to Waverley and taking a look at the procurement heat map. A really excellent tool, and then there's a couple of other examples in there as well.